My name is Karen Winey. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering Department and the Material Science and Engineering Department. Those are two different academic departments here. I've been on the faculty here since 1992. And before that, I was an undergraduate at Cornell. I worked at Eastman Kodak. I went to graduate school at the University of Massachusetts because they have a specialty in polymer science. And then I did a postdoc at Bell Labs. All of that before I started here in 1992.
That's really cool. And then how did you get interested in research in the first place?
That's a great question. So I had a work study job when I was in college. I was part of my financial aid package was to have a work study. And my first work study job was in the lab. It was in a civil engineering lab. I didn't study civil engineering, but they needed someone to help with experiments. And from that very first experience, I just really loved the sense of discovery. You're doing experiments and you're the first one to see those results. I just found that really fascinating. And so I started that my freshman year in college.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then in terms understandable to a high schooler, could you give me an overview of your research?
So I work in the area of polymers, which is a bigger category than plastics. So polymers includes like rubbers and plastics and epoxies and all sorts of different things. So I work in polymers. And what I think about, the way I approach the problem is I think about how the polymer is arranged. So polymers are big, long molecules, like cellulose is a polymer, proteins are polymers. There's very large molecules. So they can arrange different sorts of ways. And so I think about how those polymers are arranged as individuals and as groups of polymers, and then what that will mean with regard to a macroscopic property. So I go back and forth a lot between atomic level structure, molecular level structure, and macroscopic properties. And it's a big leap to go between those two, but that's the sort of research we do in the area of polymers. And the properties that we are most interested right now are transport properties. So how protons move through a plastic or a hydroxide or a lithium ion. There's a lot of devices like batteries and fuel cells and membranes that might be improved if we understood how the polymer functioned better.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then what were some of your most significant findings or publications?
That's a hard one because I'm usually most interested in what we just published, and I have trouble thinking further back. But let me think further back. So, like maybe 15, 20 years ago, I started working on nanocomposites, which are polymers that have lots of little particles in them, nanoscale particles. And we were working with carbon nanotubes. And, carbon nanotubes weren't very easy to get. They weren't very prevalent. There were only a couple groups in the world making them. But I had a colleague here at Penn who knew someone who was making them. So we got early access to those. And so we understood early on what might be possible and what ideas people were talking about that just were never going to work. And so we wrote a review article. And that's probably my most highly cited paper because it was early in the field and there was enough opinion in it. I had opinions about what was going to be possible and what was not going to be possible. And so that's been a very impactful piece of work. I also have a very impactful patent. So sometimes when we do research, it might be valuable to a company. Then it's called intellectual property as opposed to just knowledge, intellectual property. And so then you file a patent. And I have a set of patents that are about a long-term drug delivery strategy. And so a company licensed those patents and developed a drug which was FDA approved about 2 years ago to treat schizophrenia. It was a long-term, slow delivery of medication to treat schizophrenia. And so that's very exciting because that's a significant improvement in the quality of care for those patients. And then there's another set of papers that might be a little harder to describe. There's this class of polymers called ionomers. That just means there's an ionic group that's attached to the polymer. So it's an ionic polymer. And for a long time, people thought those ionic groups aggregate, and that's true. But they assume that when they aggregate, they always make spheres. Oh, like they just always make spheres. And so we, through some structural characterization and studies, we found that there's a much wider variety of structures that are possible. And when you have that wider range of structures, or the way the polymers are arranged, you have a much wider range of properties. We're still working in that area. We're pretty excited about that one.
Yeah, those all sound like so cool. And then what do you enjoy most about your research?
Well, there's a lot of fun parts. So, I'm not doing the experiments. So my students are doing the experiments, graduate students and undergraduates. And watching them develop is very satisfying. They come in not knowing much, and I'm really just training them to be researchers. They're going to go off and do research, and it's not going to necessarily be in our little area, but I'm giving them skills. I'm teaching them skills. And that's everything from how to plan an experiment, how to ask a good scientific question. Like, I often ask them, like, what are you trying to learn? You can stay very busy in the lab, but it's important that the work that you're doing in the lab is leading to an answer. And sometimes we're surprised and we get a different answer, but you at least have to formulate a question. And then you formulate an experiment that's designed to answer that question. That way of thinking, I like to see them develop that. And then writing, I really help them learn how to get all their complicated ideas that are in their head, like into a written document that anybody in the field could read and learn from. So I like working with the students a lot. I like giving presentations. So when I get to talk about my research, that's always fun because you get interesting questions from people. You think about it in a new way. And I like writing proposals. Most people don't like writing proposals. I like writing proposals to ask for money because I think it's the most creative piece of work. Because you can just you have a kernel of an idea, but then you can just expand it out, and thinking in that expansion of ideas and picking the ideas that you think will be most impactful. I think writing proposals is it's hard, and there's always a deadline and there's a lot of pressure, but it's very satisfying to write a good proposal.
Yeah, I've never thought about like writing project proposals like that.
I think it's the most creative work we do because once we've done the experiments, we kind of know the answer. And it's just a matter of communicating the answer, or communicating the new insight that we have. But proposals, you can just really let loose a little bit.
And then were there any pivotal moments in your research career that made you change topics or like what led you to look at polymers specifically?
Well, I decided I liked polymers probably my senior year in college, maybe my junior year. But I just took a course, I took a course in ceramics, you take a course in metals. I was a material science and engineering undergraduate. And then when I took the course in polymers, I just found the topic really interesting. And a lot of that has to do with the professor was really good, made it really interesting. But pivotal points, well, I already told you the story about the time my colleague came back and brought me carbon nanotubes and said, you should put these in polymers. That was a pivotal point. And then another pivotal point was in this subject area of ion containing polymers. Again, I was talking to a scientist in industry, and they told me about an unanswered question. And I was like, oh, we're getting a new instrument. And I think that instrument's going to be able to answer that question. And it wasn't a question I knew about. It wasn't an unsolved mystery in the field that I knew about. And so I always think back to that conversation. And then there's the eureka moments, like when you see a piece of data for the first time and you're like, oh, now we know. Now we have an answer. Sometimes you have to work really hard with the data. You need a lot of analysis of the data to really get the answer. But sometimes you can just look at the raw data and you're like, oh, now we know. A real eureka moment. There's been a couple of those.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then where do you see your research field expanding to? Because I know that there's obviously a bunch of new technology, there's all this AI. So like what are some interesting topics that can be further explored within the next 5 to 10 years?
I think there's a lot to do with energy related technologies. I think we have not built the best battery yet. We have not mastered the hydrogen fuel cell yet, or the electrolyzer that can transform water into hydrogen gas, to power hydrogen fuel cells. There's a lot of energy related technologies that are in need of like big step innovations. Those are the ones that I think about. I think AI for physical experiments, AI is still a bit of a challenge because of the number of data sets that are required. So in my group, I don't see AI as being particularly something we'll be able to take advantage of in the next 5 to 10 years. But I like my students to learn about it because companies generate much more data just because of the instrumentation they have. They work on a smaller, sometimes a more focused area of research. They can produce a lot of data that then can go into the AI training. So I think experimental industry work will use it, and also computational work. So I collaborate with folks who do experiments in the computer or try and look at how the polymers are arranged in the computer. And they can generate large data sets that can train AI. So I think there are positions for that, but kind of energy, and then it's really just a matter of computing power as much as anything.
Yeah, okay. And then how did you find like your passion for research, and how would you suggest a high schooler try to find their own passions in research?
Not everyone likes research. I think that the students have come through particularly undergrads, are like trying out research to see if they like it. You have to become very comfortable with not knowing what's going on. And some people just don't like that. They want to know where they're at and where they're headed, and they want it to it's like the difference between, I think, being an actor where you have a script and you're improving the script by acting it out, and being the writer. So a writer sits down with a blank page, and that's much more daunting, I think, than being an actor. Different skill sets, both very important. And I think it's kind of the same for research. I think people who love research embrace the unknown. It doesn't make them worry. You have to be comfortable just not knowing things. And that's where knowing how to ask good questions, finding experts, asking questions, extracting information out of what's written in books and in papers. You just have to really love that sense of going out in uncharted territory and just figuring it out. Usually with a lot of people around. No one's figuring this out. No one's figuring anything out by themselves. But some people just don't like that. And then there's all sorts of other good technical work to do that's not quite research.
And then what traits do you think define a great researcher in their field, and what type of traits would you look for in a potential lab member or a student?
So I usually look for folks who, well, it's kind of different for undergrads and grad students. I'll start with undergrads. So when I hire undergrad, I mostly want them to be interested in their project, because that means they're going to show up. I mean, our undergraduates are all strong, right? They're all good students. So the difference between a little higher, a little lower GPA, that's not what I look for. I look for students who, when you describe a project, their eyes light up because they're interested. And that means they're going to show up ready to work, because effort is very important in research. Like if you don't show up, if you don't work hard, you don't find the answers. And I think what makes people put in the effort is a driving interest in the project. I like to look for good matches for interest and what we're working on. Like if they're not interested in what we're working on, they can go find another group that's working on something else. And then for graduate students, which is very far away from high school, but graduate students, I just want them to have done research at least a little bit as an undergraduate. So they have some idea what they're getting into. Because my graduate students are all doctoral students, which is a 5-year adventure. And it's a big commitment. There'll be hard days. There'll be days when nothing works and the equipment breaks and you can't get the answer. And it's just like, ah. And so you need some level of resilience. And the way you build the resilience is by practice. Like you do research and you have bad days in the lab and you have good days in the lab. And you get up the next day, you're enthusiastic about your project, and you go right back in there.
Yeah, okay. And then just for our final question, what kind of tips would you give to a high schooler who just wants to get into research?
There are some universities that will let high school students come into their labs. It's a lot of paperwork to get a high school student onto campus because they're often minors. And so there's an extra level of paperwork and scrutiny. But I think it's, just work on your creativity and read science. You can read science in the newspaper, you can read it in there's popular journals, not the scientific journals where I'm publishing, but things that are written for the broader public. And just figure out what you're interested in. I mean, I would not read science online. I mean online, but it has to be a proper journal. It has to be like Scientific American, Popular Mechanics, where there's journalists who are doing the writing, not just anybody. The Department of Energy actually writes reports. A lot of the federal agencies write technical reports. So if you're interested in hydrogen and the hydrogen economy or battery technology or windmills or something, the Department of Energy writes comprehensive reports. Polymer recycling, there's a comprehensive report about that. And it just kind of lays out the state of the field and puts forward questions.
Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't know that they had those.
There's a huge library of them from the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, Department of Energy, National Institute of Health. All of them have free, public accessible documentation of their work, of their high quality, vetted by other, vetted means peers have read it and have vetted it and have deemed it worthy, accurate and worthy.